Okay, my chess friends, welcome to this chess video. And let us just review what we learned in the last video with regard to the advantage of two bishops. Because we learned there that bishops are of some advantage in open positions. But in closed positions there is no advantage for the bishops. And in such positions the bishops are restricted either in their actions by their own pawns or by the pawns of their opponent. Now when we contrast this to, of course, the action of the knight, we see that pawns or pieces are no barrier for the knights. And this proceeds essentially from the very nature of the laws of chess, because the knight is allowed to jump over pawns and pieces. Something, of course, that is forbidden for the bishops to do. So let us just review this little example before us here. See if you can determine in your own mind whether the bishops had the advantage or not. Pause the video if you need to and just think about it for a little while. Well, we can see that the bishops are in fact restricted. They're restricted by their own pawns in this instance. And the knights, on the other hand, have no real outposts in the centre. So the position is fairly even. The knights cannot exert their advantage of mobility, and the bishops, of course, cannot exert their main advantage. That, of course, is a long range of their actions. So the position is in fact fairly even. By contrast, if we look at this position here, we can see that the two bishops are essentially restricted. This bishop here is restricted by the enemy pawns, and the dark squared bishop is restricted by its own pawns. The knights, by contrast, have some beautiful squares. This knight here has the c4 square, and this knight here, of course, has the f5 square. So a general principle would be to try and keep the position closed by playing with your pieces and trying to avoid pawn breaks which open up lines for these two bishops. Now, of course, there may be exceptional circumstances if you can get a positional or a material gain by doing so, but as a general rule of principle, it's best to try and keep the position closed. We sometimes find ourselves in positions which are open or could potentially open up, and we are facing a pair of bishops. In such situations, what we should try and do is to create a pawn chain in such a way is that they restrict the bishop pair and could potentially produce a closed type of structure. And in this particular example, white goes about that. He first of all plays the move e5, restricting the dark squared bishop. After e6, c4, rook c8, c6, b takes c6, and d6, the position has transformed itself in our favour. The dark squared bishop is restricted by our pawns, and the light squared bishop is restricted, of course, by its own pawns. And we have done this by creating a pawn structure that is conducive to the restriction of our opponent's bishops. It's a very, very important strategical idea to keep in mind when you're searching for a plan, especially if the position is open or can become open. Sometimes we find ourselves in a position where an appropriate pawn chain cannot be erected to curtail the activity, the mobility of the two bishops. And you can see that in this position here. The pawn chain is fairly fixed, and if we try to create some type of barrier against the two bishops, we will simply incur weaknesses ourselves. Saying that, however, there may be other factors in the position that compensate for our opponent having two bishops. Might be an insufficiently protected king. It might be the possession of an open file we have. Or in this instance here, we can see that from the perspective of white, black has some very weak pawns, particularly the pawns on a6 and c4. So despite the fact of having two bishops, he also has some pawn weaknesses that we can work on. For example, we could maybe bring this knight here to here, target this pawn on c4. And despite the fact we have the inability to erect a pawn chain against the two bishops, there are other compensating factors in the position. And again, this is something that we can utilise and should be aware of. Here, for example, white of course has two bishops, but his king is a little exposed. And this knight here just might find some good squares in the centre. Now, the two bishops might be compensated for not only by some positional weaknesses in the camp of the person who has the two bishops, but by some pronounced pluses in the other side's position as well. For example, even though you might have a bishop and knight, you might have, a pawn majority in some flank that you can use. Control over an open file, spatial dominance, or a strong passed pawn. And these elements, of course, will compensate for the fact that you don't have two bishops. And if you look at this example here, you can see that white's rook has managed to invade the 7th rank. So even though his opponent has two bishops, he's making use of the pluses in his position or her position, as the matter may be. So this is subtle ways of evaluating chess positions. Okay, our opponent might have two bishops, but what are the pluses in our position? And can we accentuate those pluses by taking advantage of them? Here, of course, you can see white has a very strong passed pawn on the c-file. Despite the fact that the position is open and black has two bishops, this passed c-pawn will probably prove decisive. So again, the plan can be resorted to, and even if the position is open or it is closed, some positional feature might be much more dominant than one side having a pair of bishops or one side having a different combination of minor pieces. It all depends, of course. Okay, finally, let us look at or examine some methods of play against the two bishops. And we'll do that looking at a master game. It's played in 1946. We have Roy Lopez, and with the white pieces is ex-world champion Vasily Smyslov. And with the black pieces is also a former world champion, Max Euwe. Now I'm going to say Max Euwe. I don't actually know how to pronounce his name. And I apologise to our Dutch friends for doing so. It looks to me like you when it's written in English, and of course I understand that it is pronounced differently. But it feels easier for me that way. And after a4 we have the exchange of a knight for a bishop. Bishop e6, d4 and f6. Now one look at the position and you will suffice to see that black has light squared weaknesses on the queen side. However, his possession of the two bishops more than compensates for this. And if black can manage to get the move f6, s5 in, opening up a diagonal for the dark squared bishop, he'll be in really good shape. Now, if you're white, what is your plan in this position? Knowing these elements. Well, Vasily Smyslov very wisely played the move bishop b3 to swap off the light squared bishops and accentuate these light squared weaknesses on the queen side. We have bishop takes b3, queen takes, queen f7, we have a queen exchange, king takes f7, knight to e3. And white takes the all-important f5 point under control. And we can see the effect that this sequence of events has had on black's position. The dark square bishop is now a terrible piece, constricted or restricted by its own pawns. And the white knights have some beautiful squares. Just by way of example. Rook b8, a takes, and d5. White brings his pawns onto light squares, which again further enhances the restriction of the dark squared bishop. And now he threatens, of course, to play g5, making this dark squared bishop nothing more than a useless piece, a pawn in fact. Max Euwe saw this and played the move h5. We have king f1, g4, knight h4, bishop h6, and here Max Euwe plays an excellent move. Plays knight, of course, to f5. Why should he swap off his beautiful knight, which has so much potential, for the dark square bishop? He avoids, in fact, the exchange of a good knight for a bad bishop, which makes sense. Knight goes to g8, king e2, rook e4, takes, rook b1 protecting the b pawn, king d3, a3, king c2, takes, and black tries to make something of his dark square bishop. Of course he has been able to simplify play, but he's still burdened with bad minor pieces. And he tries to activate his bishop here. King comes to c2, the bishop to e1. Takes. And the knight goes in, anchoring itself, of course, on a beautiful square and protecting the g3 pawn in the process. And this bishop is still restricted, struggling for life, but it's still very much restricted. King f7, c4, and king b3. And this white, the king, of course, is heading for the square here, where it will attack the c7 square. And there are no obstacles in its path. Well, the black king, in fact, cannot enter the white position without incurring some type of material loss. And you'll see that, in fact, in the game. We have king a4, king a4, Black decides to give up the dark square bishop. What was it doing anyhow? Knight takes, and now the king can enter the position, although this has occurred at some material loss. Knight to h5, king takes on e4, knight to f6, king f5, knight e8, knight takes on c7, and it looks like this passed pawn here is really fast. But Vasily Smyslov is a wonderful endgame player. Check this out. e3, knight to b5. Beautiful move. Now why can the pawn advance? Well, simply the knight will come here and it will be forking the king and the pawn if it advances. So we have king f4, and this allows the knight to come into c3. King to g3 and c5. And after this move, of course, black resigned, because the white pawns on c5 and or d5 are simply too fast. And the knight will always be able to come here and blockade or exchange itself for any of these pawns if they try to advance. An excellent example, and we learned a number of things. An exchange of a bishop that protected weak squares. The use of those squares to create a stronghold for the knight. Remember, the knight was able to come to f5 because the exchange of the light square bishops. We saw how Vasily Smyslov played the move d5, restricting, of course, the movement of the opponent's pawns and making essentially the dark square bishop a very, very bad piece indeed. And he avoided, of course, the exchange of his good knight for that dark square bishop. So a very, very instructive game indeed. But thank you very much, my friends, for taking the time to watch this chess video, and I sincerely wish you well with your own chess. Take care and goodbye.
Nobody ever loved me like she does. Oh, she does. Yes, she does. And if somebody loved me like she does,